As we begin our panel discussion, let's entrust the conversation to the Blessed Mother, Mother of the Church, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Our Lady, Mother of the Church, Blessed John the 23rd, Blessed John Paul the Great, in the name of the Father, and the Son, of the Holy Spirit. Amen. It's the last day we can say that. So, what a pleasure it is to have with us brief introductions for both of our bishops who are here. Bishop Vasa was born in Lincoln, Nebraska, to Joe and Leona Vasa. From 1972 to 1976, he studied at Holy Trinity Seminary in Dallas, Texas, from where he obtained a Master's of Divinity degree. He was ordained to the priesthood of Jesus Christ by Bishop Glennon Patrick Flavin on May 22, 1976. He then served as curate at the Cathedral of the Risen Christ and as a teacher at Pius X High School in Lincoln until 1977, when he became an advocate on the Diocesan Marriage Tribunal. In 1979, he was sent to further his studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, where he earned a licentiate degree in canon law in 1981. On November 19, 1999, he was named the 5th Bishop of Baker, Oregon by Pope John Paul II, and he received his episcopal consecration on January 26th, the Jubilee year, from Archbishop John George Vlanzi, with Bishop Thomas Connolly and Fabian Breskowitz serving as co-consecrators. On January 24, 2011, Bishop Vasa was named the coadjutor bishop of the Diocese of Santa Rosa by Pope Benedict XVI. And on June 30, 2011, Bishop Daniel F. Walsh' resignation was accepted by Pope Benedict, and so Bishop Vasa officially succeeded him as Bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Santa Rosa in California. A strong promoter of the consecrated life, Bishop Vasa founded the Marian Sisters of Santa Rosa, a newly established religious community of Catholic women living the evangelical life of poverty, chastity, and obedience in union with the Blessed Virgin Mary in the heart of the Church. Bishop Vasa became president of the Institute for Religious Life in September 2013. Bishop, it's a joy to have you with us today. Bishop Timlin was born on August 5th, 1927. He always reminded me of Clark Kent. I don't know why, but he did. He was born in Scranton, the son of the late James C. and Helen Norton Timlin. He received his elementary education at St. John the Evangelist Grade School in South Scranton and Holy Rosary Grade School in North Scranton. He is a graduate of Holy Rosary High School in North Scranton and St. Charles College, Cantonville, Maryland. He attended St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, Maryland, before enrolling at the North American College in Rome, Italy, where he completed his studies for the priesthood. He was ordained in Rome by the Most Reverend Martin J. O'Connor, the rector of the North American College, on July 16, 1951. After his ordination, he continued studies in theology in Rome before returning to the diocese, where he was appointed as the assistant pastor of St. John the Evangelist Parish in Pittston in 1952. He was named auxiliary bishop of Scranton in 1976 and ordained in St. Peter's Cathedral on September 21st the same year. He served a 5-year term as episcopal moderator of the National Association of the Holy Name Society. Bishop John J. O'Connor appointed him chairman of the St. Pius X Seminary, Dalton Board of Advisors, and chairman of the Preparatory Commission for the Diocesan Synod in 1983. When Bishop O'Connor was transferred to the Archdiocese of New York in March of 1984, Bishop Timlin was elected diocesan administrator by the Diocesan Board of Consultors, and he was appointed the 8th Bishop of Scranton by His Holiness Pope John Paul II on April 24, 1984. He is an avid pilot, and he's still flying. I knew there was a Clark Kent connection there. And he served as a 10-year term as Episcopal liaison to the Civil Aviation Apostolate, something I did not know. Now, in July of 2004, Bishop Timlin assumed new duties as rector of Villa St. Joseph in Dunmore, and we are delighted to have you with us today as well, Bishop Timlin. Both of our bishops are great friends of the Institute of Religious Life and very supportive of the consecrated life. So we have some questions for them, and I would like both of them to comment on them, but also to sort of open this up after I'll get things going with the first couple of questions. If there's anyone out in the audience, we do like democracy and participation. If anyone would like to come up and ask a question, feel free to do so. Father Wilton would be really appreciative if someone stood up and showed that courage and came up and asked a question. But we are celebrating 40 years of the Institute of Religious Life, which really did serve as a response to the crisis of religious life here in the Church in the United States. From your perspective, I guess we'll start with Bishop Timlin, as the elder statesman, the elder bishop here. What do you think was the cause of the crisis in religious life here in the United States back then?
Well, my only claim to fame, as you heard, is that I'm old. And I've been around a long time, and I have the corporate memory. And I wish I could give a very clear answer to that question, what the cause was. Nobody seemed to see the cause as it was coming along. And there wasn't any one cause, I suppose. There were many. But the culture that we live in, of course, is part of the problem. That was happening not only in religious life, was happening in the world around us here in the United States. And I remember we had, I was at the Synod on Religious Life in 1994, and I remember sitting there with all these bishops throughout the whole world, and of course, they were extolling all the virtues of religious life, how wonderful it is. And I'm sitting there listening to all this, and I finally had my turn to speak. And I said, I can only speak for my own country. And I want to tell you that I agree with all the wonderful things that are being said about religious life. But I think we should say something about what the problems in religious life to complete the picture. And then I took off and did. Well, they were shocked. The whole Synod body seemed to be in shock. They couldn't believe it. At least they didn't want to admit it. But I spoke about the things that were happening in the 90s here in the United States. And as I say, they just couldn't believe it. And many people were very angry with me for speaking out and being so what they thought was negative. I wasn't being negative, I was just reporting actually, and saying they need our help. And they kind of turned a deaf ear, but there were some people there who wouldn't speak to me, of course. And one of the sister from the United States, she told me later, I couldn't speak to you for a whole week. Oh, I said, why not? And so she explained to me, and she was of that mind that I should not have mentioned those things. Like sisters that wouldn't go to Mass because there was a man celebrating the Mass, and things like all that kind of stuff. But anyway, it was happening way back then. And the council came along, of course, in the 60s, and we were just talking a few minutes ago, but that had a big impact on what happened in religious life. It was like lighting the fuse, and it blew up. And a misunderstanding of the council. Everybody thought that, well, this is throw everything out, and some of you can remember those days. And I think they just misunderstood that the council never intended that there would be that kind of a revolution or transformation. Well, they wanted to be transformed, but not that kind of a transformation. And I think people were leaving the convent, priests were leaving the priesthood. It was a very heady time. And right after the council, I lived with one of the bishops who was at the council. I don't want to hog this, by the way. Let's get off in a minute.
Keep
But
going.
I lived with Bishop Hannon, who was for 11 years. He was our bishop for 11 years. And he was right of Genghis Khan. He was very conservative. And he hated the council. He really did. He did not want to go to the council. And I would kind of push him a little bit. I say, oh, you must be very happy going back to the council. Oh, don't mention it. Don't mention it. I don't even want to think about it, he'd say. And he voted, and he told me this himself, against everything. Every single thing in the council, he voted against it. And you remember there were some 2,000 bishops, there were over 2,000 bishops. And the first constitution that was approved was on the liturgy. And there were 4 out of 2,000 and something that voted against it. And he was one of them. I think the other 3 pushed the wrong button or something, but, but he was against it. He said there were a few times, however, that he had to vote with the majority or he would be a heretic. And so he voted. And he said, I felt like I hit a home run with the bases loaded. I voted with the majority. But actually, God took care of Bishop Hannon. The council ended on December the 8th, 1965, and he died in Rome, never got home. On December the 15th, a week later, in Rome, in the hospital, he never came home again. And he was only in his 60s when he died. So God's figured, I'm not going to have you go back and talk against the council. You stay here. But I lived through those days, and it was a heady time, a very interesting time. Everybody was saying, this is going to be wonderful, everything's going to be fine, and we're going to not open up the windows and let in some fresh air, is what Pope John the 23rd wanted to do. But some people got a hold of it and misunderstood what the council was all about, and telling us that they had to change, you had to change the habit, for example. Well, that was fine because some of the old habits were a little bit, unwieldy and strange and so forth. They used to call them God's geese. You remember those ones, the Sisters of Charity? They were out like this. And anyway, what happened is they just began to change the habit. And I remember Monsignor Archbishop John Quinn, there was some kind of a survey that he was in charge of. And he was a good friend of mine, and I remember him saying that all you need to be for a habit is just a little bit of a thing that you put on your coat or something. That means that's the habit. That tells everybody you're a religious. We'd have to have a magnifying glass to see it, but that was the idea. And he was a good man, but he misunderstood the thing too. He's still living. Don't tell him I said that. I'll stop now. Is that enough?
That's great. Please,
I
Bishop Vasa.
just very briefly comment that my sense of the 60s, and I was a teenager in the 60s.
Rub it in. Go ahead.
I was born before you were ordained, but not by much. And in those years, there was a tremendous emphasis on self-fulfillment and introspection, and it redounded to an excessive selfishness and almost a narcissistic looking at the self. And good and solid religious communities began to be, if you will, infected with some element of, let's call it a narcissism, to the point that their personal fulfillment began to be the major mantra. And more priests were asking themselves, well, am I happy in the priesthood? And it was a question that was asked in the seminary, and I said, it doesn't matter. Are we doing God's will? That sense of personal happiness as the be-all and end-all of existence dominated, in my view, the center of religious life. and hence the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience were diametrically opposed, at least in the secular model, to self-fulfillment. What I see happening beautifully is young men and women coming forward and realizing again that the way out of selfishness is out, not to go back further in and evaluate and question the self, but rather to joyfully, openly trust in the goodness and providence of God and entrust ourselves into the hands of that God. There was a lack of faith, perhaps an inculcation of fear, but predominantly this emphasis on self-fulfillment. And you look at the self-help sections in the bookstores, all of them about fulfillment, realization of your inner self, all of those things which are not necessarily bad or evil in and of themselves, but when taken to the excess that they were in the 60s, in my view, had a horribly destructive effect as almost a new philosophy in the culture.
So in this context, it's interesting how a number of people still will continue to point to the council as a reference point. Why was everything so perfect before and everything so chaotic afterwards? And sometimes they'll go to the document on religious life and they'll see a statement calling for legitimate experimentation, and it made them very nervous. Was it just the cultural revolution was so bad at that time, or maybe it hadn't been fully foreseen at that time? A lot of times, I know Dr. Carroll mentioned 68 as sort of the year of the revolution, that you had sort of this optimism going forward being presented at the council, and then things got derailed. Was it pretty much, would you say, a result of the social situation at the time?
It was happening that way, but I want to say something about being happy. We had a priest in our diocese who was kind of cantankerous, good man, but very cantankerous. And the lady came in to him and said, "Monsignor, I'm not very happy." He said, "Happy, happy, happy. Who's happy?" So he said, "So much for happiness." but it really was happening in the world. And when the Pope John XXIII took the world by surprise when he called for the council. That was a big thing, and they said, "Well, we don't do this, Holy Father." But he went ahead and did it, and he just said, "We just want to bring things up to date a little bit, a little aggiornamento," as he said, and not really. He had no idea that it was going to go as far as it went, I'm sure. He was a conservative, actually, and a Latinist. He shortly after he became Pope, he wrote an encyclical on the Latin language and the liturgy and so forth. So he was all for Latin. But the council never said that we had to go into English. He never said that in the vernacular. But there was things were happening in Europe that were not happening in the United States. I studied in Europe from 1948 to 1952, right after the Second World War. And Europe was decadent at that time. Here in our country, right after the war, the churches were filled, the religious communities were very, very large, very active, many priests and so forth. We were booming here, you might say. In fact, the 50s were looked upon as the golden age. But in Europe, it was not so. And so he knew what was happening in Europe and in Ireland, of all places, God help us. I can remember visiting Ireland and being surprised myself, shocked as it were, at the way things were in Ireland. Back in 1951, it was happening in Europe. And so he called the council, I believe, to bring it up to date and to address those things in Europe. But the Americans were the kind of people that take a hold of something and jam it through. And we took it over, as it were. They used to say that Rome makes all the rules and the Americans keep them. They didn't keep them over there, but we kept them. And so we took the council, and we really, the sisters did, and did a bang-up job, I mean, of implementing the council. And of course, again, there was that misunderstanding of how far you were supposed to go with it, but they took the ball and ran with it. And that is what I think happened. And sad to say, we're reaping the benefits of that, or not the benefits, but whatever you want to call them, of all that wrong thinking about the council. People today still blame the council for all the evils and all the bad things that are happening in the church in our country. But you can't blame the council. The council was inspired by the Holy Spirit. I write to some people who are very upset about the Pope and very upset about the council. And they don't want to have anything to do with the council. And that's wrong, actually. And I'm wearing out pins writing to them telling this, but they just don't seem to be willing to accept it. But anyway, what was the question?
I don't remember, but you answered it. Please, Bishop.
Certainly the council had an effect on religious life, and the culture played a part in it. And there is an element of religious life. I'm sure if we look at the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where the structure and the formation was very rigid, very strict, and perhaps lacking in some of the humanity, and a recognition of the very real human persons that are involved in the formative process. Unfortunately, I think when the council came along, kind of gave permission to do away with some of the aesthetics, some of the disciplinary measures, and again, that person and the good of the human person took on such an enormous center that everything centered on that, so that obedience became mutual discernment. Poverty meant, don't suffer too much, because we don't want it to harm your delicate self. And chastity, there was always, we have to reconfigure this. We have to understand it in a different way. In other words, the humanity element of it began to displace the divine qualities that religious are called to exemplify. And there was a need, I think, in some of the formation to recognize the human formation element, to strengthen that, to reinforce that, to give due credit to that, so that the persons who were involved in religious life had a deeper sense of self, a deeper maturity, a greater freedom, a greater ability perhaps to engage with one another and to engage with the culture. So that I saw as good. But again, when it kind of opened up the doors, then there was this reactivity, and again, the self dominated. And as you know, in religious life today, as we struggle with our individual spiritual lives, the first rule that Jesus says is you got to leave yourself behind. And if you put the self in charge of the cart, you're going to be in deep trouble. And I think the self was dominant in the 60s. And we have a situation hopefully now where, again, the proper driver, Christ, is again at the helm.
Thank you. George Weigel recently referred in an article to John the 23rd and John Paul VIII as sort of the bookends of the council. And obviously both men had a great love and esteem for the religious life. Given that this is such a historic weekend for our church, and we're going to see these two men elevated to the altars, any particular thoughts or comments you would share with us on either pope in terms of their impact on the consecrated life?
I never met Pope John the 23rd. He's the only one that I never met since Pius XII. I saw all the other ones after that, but I didn't have any money when he was the Pope, so I couldn't go back to Rome. But anyway, they both had an impact on religious life. Pope John the 23rd, of course, the traditional religious life, but Pope Pope John Paul called the Council on Religious Life, and I was able to be at that council, as I mentioned. And you might say, well, how did I ever get at that council? Because I was the president of the Institute on Religious Life. That's the only explanation for it. How that worked is every country in the world is allowed to vote on the bishops that they're going to send to the council. And it was based on the number of Catholics in the country. The United States is a very big country, so we were able to send 4, and that was the limit. No country could ever send more than 4 bishops to this council. And we elected 4 from our conference, and after the elections, Pope John Paul appointed Cardinal George, who was the Bishop of Yakima out in the state of Washington, and me from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Said, how come you got appointed by the Pope? It's only because I was the president of the Institute on Religious Life, and they had some friends in Rome, apparently, who were able to put the bug in the ear over there, and so we were appointed, and we were there. And I forgot what I was going to say about that, but anyway, that happens when you get to my age. But the Pope sat there for all those sessions. It took a whole month, and we met morning and afternoon. And he sat for all those sessions, never said a word. He just sat there and listened. Or either maybe he was sleeping, I don't know, but he sat there anyway and listened to all these things that were being said. It was an unusual way to do anything. We would never do it that way in the United States. It was a very inefficient way of, in my perspective, idea anyway, of running something. But people we could could all put in what we wanted to say, and then we'd have our opportunity to say that over a microphone, and they were instantaneous translations. But you'd have someone getting up and say, there are 4 persons in the Trinity, and someone would get up and say, there are 2 persons in the Trinity, and they'd say, okay. You know, that's how it was going. They were saying all kinds of things that were contradictory, and no reaction at all. And then we broke up into small groups according to language. And I was in a group with Cardinal Bernardine, who was from the Archbishop of Chicago. And he had been at councils before and knew how it worked. The rest of us didn't know an awful lot about it. But you sit there and you discuss these different things and you come up with propositions. And we'd agree with them, and then we turn those whole things in, and you never know what happens to them after that. Then a book comes out at the end of the council, and that was Consecrata Vita or something, Consecrata something or other.
Vita Consecrata.
Vita Consecrata. And that came on, and I looked in there for my intervention. There was 1.5 sentence in the whole book that was, you might say had something to do with that, but it was glossed over completely. But there were several people at that council who were like Cardinal O'Connor, for example, God be good to him, and Cardinal Laghi, God be good to him too. They were Americans, and they called me privately, quietly, and told me how grateful they were for what I had said and what I did. But they would never say it publicly. And there was a German bishop who came to me too, and spoke to me in Italian, and coraggio, he said. He agreed with me. But for the most part, there was a cardinal there who did not want to even speak to me, an English-speaking cardinal, not from our country. But he was upset that anybody would dare mention all those problems that we had in religious life, that we are dealing with now. The Holy See has finally come around to dealing with these problems that we have in religious life, in some communities anyway, the LCWR. But I knew what I was going to say. The LCWR was the only group that could speak for all the religious in the United States. That's the way it was. In each country, you had to have one group that spoke for all the sisters. Well, we are a big country, and that's all we have was the one, the LCWR. And it was such a diverse group. I mean, you had the large religious communities who were losing their members by day. And I remember I told them that the religious communities in our country, they're half what they were a few years ago. They're half. It went down that fast. Something is wrong, we were saying. Well, they were in this group, and they're still around, of course. And you had the sisters like yourselves who were wanting to live the religious life as you knew it, living the vows with the habit and so forth. And they could not sit in the same room with these sisters. I mean, we're not on television now, so I'm not going to get a lot of letters about this, but it's a fact. I mean, they could not sit. Maybe we are on television. I don't take back anything that I said, actually, but I might get shot. But anyway, they could not sit in the same room, and this is what they told me. Because the sisters who were, what you might say, more progressive, not wearing the habit, they mocked these sisters for wearing the habit. It was that bad. It was very difficult for them. And so something had to be done. And Cardinal Hickey, who was the Archbishop of Washington, was on the side of the traditional sisters. And he was responsible. He was working with Father Hardin and all these other people and myself and several others, and got the message to Rome that we had to do something about this situation in the United States. So now we have two groups that can speak with the sisters. And you know more about this than I do, actually. And that's how it came about. Cardinal Hickey was the one who did the work and got the message over to Rome. But you have to remember that Rome is Rome. Rome is in Europe, and they have a European mentality. And we are quite different over in our country, but they had to get the message that this is not working in the United States. And so, again, I've forgotten what the question was, and I got off on a number of tangents, but you have to bear with me. But Bishop, you want to say something?
The two bookends, John the 23rd, and I'm obviously too young to have any recollection of him, other than the recollection of my grandparents speaking very fondly and enthusiastically about John the 23rd. And they were not necessarily strongly expressive individuals, but I just remember that little anecdote. And it was similar to kind of the reaction that we see to Pope Francis. You know, kind of a renewed energy, a kind of excitement, a thrill that something great was about to happen. We're in this room largely the generation of Pope John Paul II, and had a tremendous concern and pastoral concern for authentic religious life. The number of things that he had written, the number of comments he had made about religious. And I do remember Bishop Flavin coming to the ad limina visits in Rome with Pope John Paul II, and coming back and telling us the Holy Father asked about the state of religious life in the United States. And it was always something that he was very pastorally concerned about and interested in, but also I think perhaps one of the great crosses that he as Pope had to bear with tremendous sadness, for he would have had a recollection of what religious life in its authentic beauty looks like, and how much it witnesses to the beauty of Christ and the beauty of the church, and to see that crumbling and his seeming helplessness almost to reinvigorate it. But he did it almost inadvertently simply by being the pastor that he was for those many years as Pope. And the young people that are attracted now to priesthood and religious life are attracted, I I believe, largely by the witness of his life. And so I would credit him simply by the strength of his personal witness and his personality and his faithfulness and his self-sacrificing faithfulness as, if you will, the seed for the renewal of religious life.
Could I just add one little anecdote about Pope John Paul and the religious? There were some religious sisters that came in to see him, and Pope, in his with his Polish accent, he said, "You don't love me." And they said, "Oh, Holy Father, we do. We really do love you." "Oh, yes, we do." No, 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 you don't love me." And they kept saying, "Oh, yes, Holy Father, we really do love you." "Oh, yes." He says, "Not like you used to."
Father Matthew Phelan from the Mercedarian Friars. And as a former vocation director in our order, and I know it can be at times it's a challenge for our current vocation director, but many diocesan vocation directors in practice seem to recognize vocations to the diocesan priesthood and vocations to the feminine expressions of consecrated life, whereas men religious or men consecrated persons are often viewed as competition in the field of vocation. So my question is, what can we do together to overcome this tendency so that vocations to the religious brotherhood and priesthood can be encouraged by diocesan directors and the diocesan priesthood supported and encouraged by religious directors of vocations?
I went back to Nebraska several years ago when Bishop Bruskowitz allowed me to do confirmation in my home parish. And I talked to some of the young men about becoming priests and said, the Diocese of Baker needs priests. The next day in the Chancery office, Bishop Bruskowitz had gotten wind of my comments and said, "Vasa, fish in your own pond." To which I said, "Bishop, Weston is my pond." But there is a sense, you're right, there is a competition that we as bishops feel, and I have no qualms about the Christian brothers recruiting brothers for their community from the high schools in my diocese which they run. I have no qualms about the Dominican fathers, if they have a parish, to say someone is attracted to the Dominicans. What pains me is I have a diocesan priest in a parish for 50 years, and a young man finally decides to join the priesthood, and he joins the Jesuits or the Dominicans or the Franciscans, and I'm thinking, why, when the one who nourished you in the faith was this diocesan priest, would you seek, this other community? Well, they're younger, they're more vibrant, they're more appealing and attractive. This diocese has only old men. So there is that sense of competition, and it is a reality. In my view, if religious orders want to recruit vocations in my diocese, they need to be serving in my diocese. And then I would certainly actively and enthusiastically support them. And I do encourage, men who say, "Well, I don't think I'm called to the diocesan priesthood." I think, well, okay, fine. But I always tell men, in my view, if you're raised in a parish with a diocesan priest and you know there's need for diocesan priest, God calls you where the need is. And to review, are you seeking this vocation for your own personal happiness, or are you called to serve? And I always think, charity really does begin at home, and we're called to serve in our local neighborhood. So there is a tension there, and a realistic tension, but certainly we are open to religious vocations, but sometimes it hurts because very good men that maybe we have worked with for 10 years say, "I'm going to join the seminary for that religious order." And it's like, well, why? Well, because they came and gave a mission one time. Okay, I understand that, but it's difficult. It's difficult.
I agree. There is a tension there. Of course, it's a natural thing that you are in such great need for priests in the diocese. You're obviously going to be very concerned about that, and it's a natural thing, I suppose. But we have to rise above that, of course, and be generous to the church and I come from a diocese, the Diocese of Scranton, which was a tremendous diocese as far as vocations were concerned. Some people say it was better than going into the mines, but anyway, we had a lot of vocations. We had one year we had 70 in our. It's not a very large diocese, but moderate size. But we had 78. One of the priests still living now. He's about 90 years old, but he told me there were 78 people, all qualified, who applied to the diocese for 1 year. 78 in the Diocese of Scranton. And when I came along, the bishop would only take half of those who applied to the diocese. All qualified, of course. You have to take that into consideration. They were all people who were good men, but he just didn't have enough room. He couldn't take more priests than he needed in the diocese. So I remember when I applied, there were 24 of us. And he saw all of us all together, one after the other. And did you ever think of going to a religious community? He said to us. No, Bishop. After the first one went in, we knew what the questions were. And he said, no, Bishop, I never thought about that. Did you ever think of going to another diocese? No, Bishop, never thought about that either. And he said, well, there are 24 of you out there now, and I can only take 12. And you'll hear from me in a week or so. Goodbye. And then, anyway, that's how it went. Now, a lot of the ones that he picked never finished, so they filled them up later on with people that he let go. 3 of my classmates went down to Richmond, Virginia, the very day that they got this letter saying that they were not going to be accepted in Scranton. We had so many vocations. The bishop said all my chaplains are coming back after the war. They never did come back, but he thought they were going to come back anyway. And we had more priests. We had 500 diocesan priests in the Diocese of Scranton in my time. 500. We're down now to about, how many? It's gone down a lot more since I left. Not because I left, but anyway. We really need diocesan priests in Scranton now. It has changed. That has happened. We are affected by the rest of the country, and we've had some bumps in the road. So right now, we used to have about 75 seminarians at any given time when I was a seminarian. And now, I hate to say that we only have about 7 or 8 seminarians for all the way through. We have no vocations coming up this coming year. So we are in dire straits now, like everybody else. Once upon a time, we had a superabundance of vocations. And we had a vocation program in the diocese where we fostered religious vocations, actually did. We had every program in the whole diocese, at every level, had to have a vocation program every semester, every year. And it would be a religious sister, a religious priest, and a diocesan priest, but they were all on this program, and they all had to come and sign up and say, this is for the public school too. We had all the public school children had to do this, and all the Catholic school children had to be part of this program. And this is when we had that superabundance. So we were fostering vocations to the religious life at that time, and going out to other dioceses too. And I remember, I'll finish with this. When I was in the seminary at St. Mary's in Baltimore, a lot of the bishops from out in Oregon used to come through and talk to all the seminarians, and telling them that it was a bishop from Tucson came out, and a bishop from Spokane, Washington, I remember. I almost wound up in Spokane, Washington, or Tucson, Arizona, which was a John Wayne place in those days, you know. And that was how it was, just a country diocese, grown since then. But they used to come through and talk to us about the need that they had in those places. And I'm thinking to myself, they don't need me in Scranton. Why should I be going to Scranton? Maybe I should be going out to Tucson, or out going up to Yakima, or going out to Spokane, Washington. I was pondering over doing that. And they called me and said, you're going to Rome. I thought that settled that. So that's how I wound up in Scranton. But you can see, it is, the question is a good question, of course, and as religious you would be wondering why we don't promote vocations. We had sisters in Scranton, we had the IHM sisters, and they had at least 35 professed every year. And the Sisters of Mercy, we had a province in Scranton, and the diocese in Dallas, actually, which is Dallas, Pennsylvania, and they had the same number. They had vocations galore at that time. And now if they have one a year, they're thrilled because it's just, they're going down. All their sisters are elderly. Those two communities are literally dying on the vine. It would take a miracle of some kind to reverse that, but they have accepted that it's not going to happen. They just go on, we've done our job and we do the best we can, we move on. That's not the feeling here with the Institute on Religious Life. We're fostering new communities all the time to come along. And this, how this all fits into God's plan, we won't know until we get to heaven. But it fits in there somehow. There's some reason for why these organizations that were so vibrant. The sisters, the IHM sisters, taught me for 12 years. They look at me and say, you have nobody to blame but yourselves. So anyway, they had vocations galore, you know, and now they're not teaching in schools at all for all practical purposes. There might be one or two here or there. And the same with the Sisters of Mercy. They did tremendous work for the church. And do we miss them? Oh, sorely. We do miss them. So we're waiting for your communities to blossom and come forth so you'll be able to, again, be the great help to the church that you once were, the sisters once were. You're a great help right now. We don't have to wait that long, but you're there and you're doing the work, and that's tremendous, and I commend you for that.
Well, now that the choir is here, I think it's fitting that we bring this to a conclusion, but I'd like to thank both Bishop Vasa and Bishop Timlin for their wisdom and insight, sharing that with us today. Mass will be offered here at 4 o'clock. Thank you so much.